very good that we can see you, and we know you are there, Ms. Bartman. We are doing an inquiry as the House of Commons Procedure Committee, which we've been working on for some time, which is about how the UK, the Westminster Parliament and the House of Commons interacts. And it started off with the devolved legislatures throughout the United Kingdom. But we've actually realised, as doing our work, that what we do in Westminster also has an impact on the overseas territories. And that's why we're very, very pleased that we've had written evidence from overseas territories, but that we're also able to do today an oral evidence session so we can put our questions to the witnesses. And we're very grateful to Ms. Bartman from the Falkland Islands and Mr. Farrell, the Premier of Montserrat, for joining us today. And I want to start with one quick question, I hope, which is in what ways do you currently interact with the House of Commons, and how effective do you think that interaction is? Perhaps if we can start with you, Mr. Farrell. You're on mute.
Thank you very much. It's very nice to be with you this afternoon, this evening. I'm not sure that we have much of a contact with Westminster. In most cases, unless there are conventions which they want to extend or wish for us to determine whether we want to be extended to us, there's very little communication between Montserrat and the UK Parliament, the House of Commons. Very little.
Thank you.
In recent times, though, the Speaker has been very much engaging us. But from a political and policy standpoint, there was very little connection, very little interaction between us.
Thank you. Ms. Barkman, what about from the Falkland Islands?
Thank you. Yes, so our London representative engages with MPs on a regular basis to try to keep them updated with what's happening in the Falklands. We invite groups such as the APPG members down to come and visit us. We try to maintain a regular contact. A lot of the ministerial level contact comes through the Joint Ministerial Council, but we will engage obviously with committees, and particularly such as this one, when there are inquiries in place. We've been trying to push for improved links between, certainly a civil service links between the UK and the Falklands in areas of kind of mutual benefits. Some of those have been identified around climate change or regional high seas work. So, but as it comes to engagement with UK Parliament, we're very much, I'd say, trying to improve the information knowledge base in the UK Parliament about the Falklands, but mostly working on and engaging in things as requested.
Thank you. Nikki Aitken.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you both for joining us today. How well do you think MPs in the House of Commons understand the overseas territories, and specifically Montserrat and the Falklands? Perhaps we could start with Premier Farrell on that. You're on mute.
Someone on mute.
Thank you. That's a very good question. In recent times, we were of the view that parliamentarians across Whitehall knew very little about the OTs. Yes, they hear about the OTs, but in terms of understanding the relationship between the overseas territories and the United Kingdom, I think they had very little understanding of such. I would admit, though, that in recent times, there has been more of an understanding and appreciation for the overseas territories through a number of conduits. The FCDO has been working very well with us to ensure that parliamentarians understand. Our local rep, we have a local office in London, and Stanton has done extremely well in interacting with parliamentarians unofficially sometimes, so that they can appreciate and understand Montserrat. And I have taken responsibility on myself to share knowledge with parliamentarians and with members of the FCDO team in terms of Montserrat and Montserrat history, Montserrat culture, Montserrat affiliation with the United Kingdom. And so we're getting there. And in particular, over the last year, with the Prime Minister asking ministries and departments to identify leads within their ministries and departments with responsibility for overseas territories affairs, I think the message is now getting clearer that the overseas territories are now an integral part of the United Kingdom, and more politicians and parliamentarians are inquiring about Montserrat and Montserrat's contribution to overall development in the United Kingdom, and of course, how the United Kingdom can help us to develop our country. So I would say in closing that there is a move now for better understanding by United Kingdom parliamentarians of the OTs.
Thank you very much. And Ms. Barkman, your views? Hello?
Yes, thank you. I'd say, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. I'd say certainly in terms of the Falkland Islands, I'd say through the lens of 1982 is what we're best known as, which is obviously a significant part of UK history and will forever be in complete admiration for those who stood up to save us and to protect our right to self-determination. The modern Falklands, I'd say, is a lot less well known. I've been a politician for 6 years, and I know that if I ask an MP what illegal economic blocks that Argentina currently lodge against the Falkland Islands, it may be difficult for them to name more than one. I also know that if I mention Argentina, it may cause their eyes to glaze over a little bit, as it's a threat not easy to engage with whilst expecting it to change. Although I would say 100% the cross-party support for our right to self-determination in the face of that threat is unwavering, and we're very appreciative of that. But I have found that when we've gone to MPs and certainly ministers, and speaking to our last few ministers, Amanda Milling, Lord Goldsmith, and now Minister Rutley, as well as our current Shadow Minister, Stephen Doty, in areas where they can look to collaborate, certainly on matters to do with the environment, climate change, or fishing, things we can tackle together, it's been a much better engagement. And I'd say that the steps that the UK and the FCDO has taken more recently in the joint declaration has been a positive step, but what we make of that, I hope, will be a lot more than just words on a communique. There's a lot of work to go into what was agreed at the last Joint Ministerial Council. And the Speaker of the House, Lindsay Hoyle, has been also a great advocate of the OTs, just to reiterate, and an honourable colleague mentioned them already. But in order to get the information out there about the OTs, it does need ownership and leadership from the UK government to help support that.
Thank you. James Gray.
Just a couple of things, if I may. I think there's a sharp difference between the Falklands and Montserrat. In my experience, recent years, at least since 1982, relations with the Falkland Islands have been extremely close. And I myself was down there a couple of weeks back with a select committee. The All-Party Group is extremely active and takes groups down. I'm chairman of a thing called the Armed Forces Parliamentary Scheme, which has a gang goes down to the Falklands every year, and so on. There's really a big interaction with the Falklands. Whereas Montserrat, I think there is an all-party parliament group of Montserrat. I'm not sure how active it is or who runs it even. Do you know, sir? Is that something you're familiar with, or is that...
On mute. Can we unmute?
Yes, I am familiar with the parliamentary all-party grouping. And I discussed it with my colleague, with my representative in London in November. I think Andrew
Rosendale. Is it Rosendale?
Yes, has been self-appointed, and I'm very, very blunt here, self-appointed Montserrat rep on the all-party grouping. I have some concerns as to how that the selection process takes place. I know that I was advised that it's an interest by individuals, but I would still prefer to have a say in who those persons are who wish to represent our interests. And clearly, the means of communication between the particular OT and the representative. I'm not sure that Mr. Rosendale has been to Montserrat in recent times. I'm in office for just over 4 years. I'm not sure I had a conversation with him. And I would expect that a group such as that would be able to agitate and argue Montserrat's position. But I'm not sure that grouping has proven its worth, to be honest.
Well, just to interrupt you very briefly, if I may, forgive me rather rudely, all party groups are set up by a member of parliament who chooses to set them up. And if I choose to set up the all party group for the Caribbean, I can do so, let's say, for Montserrat. There's no rule as to what you then do, and many of them are very inactive, which I asked you, whereas the all party group for the Falklands is extremely active. It does a great many things. We had a parade not so very long ago in the 40th anniversary of the war. And so on. And so the Falklands are extremely active all-party group and extremely active with the Armed Forces Public Scheme and with all sorts of other things. Whereas, as you say, Montserrat seems to be, you've rather missed out.
Very much so. I guess the individual might not agree with me, but I think from my standpoint, we are really missed out. I'm not sure that we get the kind of representation that we'd expect from the member of the organization.
Well, there's no point about APGs, is there's no formality about them, and they are merely things that happen informally. And unless you were somebody, if you're an enthusiast, if you're someone who loves Montserrat, who would set it up and really make it active and really make it happen. But I suspect that probably there just isn't such a person in the UK Parliament.
Patrick Grady.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you both for joining us. We've been speaking about the interaction with Parliament. I wonder if we might focus specifically on legislation and how, or if you have the need or opportunity to influence legislation directly here at Westminster. So how effectively is the UK government in consulting your territories and representing your views, and how do you engage with parliamentarians who might want to make amendments to legislation that might have an impact on the territories? And maybe we'll hear from Teslin first.
Ms. Blackburn?
Thank you for the question. I think that it very much speaks to how we should be represented in that process. I suppose, as we've outlined in our written evidence, it also raises a question about whether it is appropriate for the House of Commons to be legislating for the OTs when their knowledge from a country may be weak, and as James Grace just pointed to, if they don't have personal interest to familiarise themselves with a territory or with another country, then whether they should also hold the responsibility, that power to be able to legislate for them, and with nothing to protect that territory from personal agendas of MPs. So that for us has been a bit of a bugbear when it comes to the process of how you go about legislating for the governance of an OT, for example, which is a reserved power certainly in our constitution. But that needs a framework around it, and potentially even a threshold to be able to say when it would be appropriate to do so and to what level. And I think that lack of clarity does leave a lot of people, probably at both the UK House of Commons side, but also with us as a self-governing territory, assume, well, do we just react to a piece of legislation that's going to be imposed upon us and start lobbying from there? Isn't it better to consult from the very start to understand if it's appropriate, to understand the consequences of that legislation for the overseas territories? And in the case of the Falklands, whether we could possibly even live up to the expectations of it. There's some regulatory requirements to legislation that we just simply couldn't meet without creating a whole new department to do so. And so whether it may be inappropriately placed, and it may also be inappropriate to affect. So it is very obviously linked to that previous point about familiarisation, but for democracy to function properly in the Falklands, we also need to know what's wholly within our control as a democratic society, and when and how that baton for the UK to legislate for us, how that process will work. And it needs to be clearly defined, in my eye.
Thank you. Just in terms of formalising things, and maybe when Mr. Farrell comes in, he can speak about this as well. With the devolution settlement on the British Isles, we have a process of legislative consent motions. So the devolved parliaments in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, if legislation is passed at Westminster that directly affects that would otherwise be passed by the devolved parliaments, then they're expected to grant their consent through a formal legislative consent process. So is there any kind of equivalent at the moment, or would that kind of thing be helpful, I think is what you're saying?
So there's no equivalent process at the moment. I think what we've tried to establish at the last Joint Ministerial Council in particular, when the Foreign Commonwealth Office was driving this move for a joint declaration, which talked about that process and about creating a consultation framework, and the UK made a commitment in that document last November to say that it would consult with OTs on the construction of legislation. We've not yet seen that in action, so that's probably been a product of it. But actually seeing that specific framework isn't something that we've seen yet. So while it's been high level, confirmed that will be what's going to happen, we've not actually seen the detail of how it's going to work in process. Certainly to see if it fits each overseas territory's requirements. It's understood that quite a lot of the detail from that joint declaration will come out of bilaterals, but this is the big fundamental question, is when is it appropriate to legislate for OTs, and what is our position and our engagement in that, because fundamentally we should be front and centre of it.
Thank you. And yes, Mr. Farrell, the same reflections, if you can, on how you currently influence legislation and whether some more formality or different processes around that would be helpful.
Thank you very much for the question. There's absolutely no mechanism for us to consult with the United Kingdom government in terms of any legislation that is imposed on those territories. They usually do those legislations after Parliament, and they're given. Very seldom do we have a say in it. The problem I have is that our Constitution allows us to make legislation here, right? But those legislation must be assented to by the governor, of course, in conjunction with the FTO. So they have a say in what legislation we pass. But on the other hand, they will pass legislation and just pass it down to us. Unlike the co-dependent territories and stations who have a say, for instance, I understand that if they are promoting legislation to co-dependent countries and territories, they discuss with them. In our case, there's absolutely none. And my contention has always been, you cannot be in the UK and design legislation for someone 7,000 miles away from you, whose culture is different, whose religious background is different, whose socioeconomic background are totally different, and you are going to design legislation, a one-size-fits-all legislation for all of the OTs, irrespective of where they are. Just does not work that way. And we have had the discussion at Joint Ministerial Council, we've had discussions in the forums, and I've said to them, yes, we are willing to consult, and if you're willing to pass a legislation or to enact legislation to impact the overseas territories, at least we should have a say at the beginning rather than the end. Because very seldom do you have any opportunity to change those legislation at the back end. Whereas if there's negotiation at upfront, you may be able to influence the contents, some aspect of those legislation. So the way these happen now, we do not have a say in any legislation that you intend to pass on the OTs, impose on the OTs.
And Dixon. Thank you, Chair. It's actually a question for Ms. Barkman, actually, and it's about, there was a line in the written evidence that you submitted to the committee that I just wanted to ask a little more about. And in it you say that we're talking about legislating for the overseas territories and the principle of legislating for the UK Parliament creating that legislation. And the phrase is, this is particularly important when knowledge of the territories is weak and the motives of some who seek to legislate for the overseas territories are often driven by a personal agenda rather than the principle of good governance. And
I can see Mr. Farrell nodding as well. I wondered if you could expand on that, because that's quite a worrying statement to suggest that your experience shows that there's a personal agenda rather than the principles of good governance. Could you expand a little more on that?
Thank you. So I think we've seen in the examples that have gone through UK Parliament where it's had a kind of an economic impact upon the UK overseas territories, not particularly always on the Falklands, but I'd say the overseas territories as a whole, that those impacts aren't taken into account when that legislation is progressed. Obviously, it happened in regards to the public the registers of beneficial ownership, but there are also kind of instances of, I'd say, declaring marine protected areas across the Central Island, which was one that was cited as removing the economy of the people there. They've since not been downgraded as to not have a permanent civilian population, as you'll probably be familiar with. But certainly the public registers of beneficial ownership was one that was probably in mind when that sentence was written.
Okay.
And I'd say on the whole, it sits there as an example of a concern that, while there is great interest in the protection of self-determination of Falkland Islanders now, we also know that historically that's not always been the case with the UK government. And as much as we'd like to rewrite parts of history that don't suit us, there was a time in the 60s and 70s when the Falklands were going to be traded like a commodity, and its people too. And very fortunately, that is no longer the case. We have also got huge economic blocks, legal sanctions placed against us by Argentina, which we need the assistance of the UK government to help us navigate. It's probably part of the reason why the connectivity is so poor today is that we're trying to navigate some of these issues to try to get international businesses to set up here in the Falklands when they're being threatened by our neighbour. We have issues with connectivity and flight connectivity in particular because of this. So I'd say to go, sorry, I went on a bit of a sidebar there, but to go back to your original point, I think, and as Mr. Farrell has also explained, the knowledge of the overseas territories is often high level or absent in certain areas. So to be able to deliver complex legislation that changes that without a familiarity of the consequence is always going to be a risk. And whether it was an active one and whether it was intended or unintended, it's still going to always carry those risks.
Thank you.
Thank you. Did you want to say anything, Mr. Farrell?
Thank you. I totally agree with Ms. Barkin. I, for one, usually follow your discussions in the House, on House Commons TV. And I know that there are some there seem to be personal agendas. There are topics that are raised by individuals. And those topics are pushed through by those individuals for months, for years, for several sessions in the House. And of course, the public register is a classical example of one of those agenda items in the House, which is pushed by individuals. And without knowing fully well, understanding the consequences and the reasons why such legislations are in place in those territories. Most of the countries who are forced to introduce public register already have some form of public register. And but I don't believe, and the economy is spent very heavily on revenues coming from these companies that are in those OTs. And I think more needs to be done in terms of understanding why are we doing these things? How can you work with your territories to improve the deliverables of the services? Yes, we all agree. We are in favor of governance and transparency. How can you help us to improve rather than pushing a policy agenda, which to me is an individual agenda, and which in the end would derail the economic structure of any country. some countries cannot survive without this international business. So how can you, rather than pushing the agenda to shut down the business as far as we are concerned, how can we work with them? Because the House of Commons agenda, and let's work together from the House of Commons and the various overseas territories to see how best we can improve on those services rather than calling for a blanket shutdown. That's the impression that we get from you.
Thank you. Nigel Mills.
Thank you. Can I just turn to the issue of whether the overseas territories having a MP in the House of Commons or the Lords that represents all of them is a good idea or not? And I think there was a pretty clear view from the Falkland Islands submission that that wasn't a very attractive option. I mean, is that still the case? And Mr. Farrell, do you agree you don't want an MP in the House of Commons?
I don't know that we have had public opinion on it. There were pockets of discussion on whether there should be someone in Parliament, in House of Commons, representing those territories. We're still trying to figure out how that will work. I've spoken to my representative in the UK to see what information we can gather. We are not clear as to how it will work. Are you asking us to nominate, to elect somebody from among the MPs who represent the OTs? Are you asking us to represent one person for each OT? Or are you asking us to represent a block of MPs to represent a number of OTs? We cannot say yes. I cannot say yes or no to it until I'm clear as to the processes that could be engaged in doing such. Once I'm clear on how the representation will take place and who will determine those representation, then we might be in a better position to determine yes or no to the question.
Are there any options that are attractive to you? Would you like one MP in the House of Commons just representing your territory? I mean, it seems quite unlikely that's going to happen, but is that something you would like, or would you not like that, and be happy to have one representing all 12 of the overseas territories? I mean, are there any attractive at all?
That would be difficult to have one person representing all 12. The question is, what would the relationship be between the FCDO and that individual? Would they be speaking out of turn? Would they be speaking to us and to the FCDO? Would our representation be through them directly or through the FCDO to them? Again, I would prefer to have some time to have some deliberation on the subject without committing myself to the position.
Okay, thank you. And Ms. Bartman, I think you were pretty strident in the submission that the Falkland Islands didn't want any representation in the UK Parliament. Is that still your position a few weeks later?
Certainly, we've been consistent on this, I think, and certainly history has reinforced. We've currently got the opportunity to appeal to all members of the House of Commons and the House of Lords, and we do not agree that funneling all of our concerns through one MP would give us that same breadth of reach. And we've been speaking today about familiarisation. I don't think having one person designated to be the go-to person for Falklands issues would help improve the familiarisation across the rest of the House of Commons about the Falklands. They wouldn't be democratically elected from the people of the Falklands. I should imagine it would be difficult to structure and doesn't take into account the understanding that we are a people who choose a free association with the UK. So in terms of that, it would be difficult for us to then also go out internationally to advocate that we're a self-governing people who have a right to self-determination if we're part of that collective UK Parliament system as well. One of the very common misrepresentations that Argentina likes to promulgate internationally is that we are a British implanted population, and it wouldn't lend well to that in terms of optics either. But certainly from an administrative position and advocacy, it would dilute our opportunity to familiarise ourselves with the House of Commons.
James Gray.
Tesman, two kind of linked
If
questions.
that's strident enough.
Perfectly.
Perfect. Two sort of linked questions. First of all, to what degree would you agree with me that the Constitution of the Falklands was extremely complicated with the governor who's sent to the Commission of South Georgia and the chief executive and yourselves is extremely complicated and difficult to come to any kind of clear, very difficult to work out who has the relationship with Parliament. But secondly, linked to that, would you not agree with me that perhaps because of that, the informal relationships which you have are exceptionally good? I think the Falkland Islands office in London is brilliant. They've worked tremendously well for many, many years. Your relationship with select committees, with informal groups in Parliament, with the military, as I mentioned, is superb. And therefore, your influence in the UK Parliament is much stronger than it would be if you had, for example, an MP for all the overseas territories, for example, which would be watered down. Would you accept that thesis that you at the moment, the interests of the Falklands, partly because of 1982, but not only, the interests of the Falklands are better represented in Parliament than they would be if there were any kind of formal arrangement? Don't tell you didn't hear all that.
Thank you. I think the work certainly that our London office does is spectacular, and I certainly would agree that I suppose knowledge of our small population down here in the southwest Atlantic is a lot higher across Parliament than would belie the size of us, certainly. And it's through that effort and through the opportunity to reach all MPs and all members of the House of Lords. I would also probably highlight that whereas we have the opportunity to, and it might come up in a later question, but whereas we have the opportunity to advocate to everybody currently, which is the preferred system, the issue is how seriously those concerns kind of get carried through at crucial stages, and that's where the need for more certainty around how far our issues go in the representation process is important to understand. And this very Falkland-specific example that certainly present in my mind is the UK's decision to exit the EU. So we fully support the UK public's right to decide their relationship with the European Union. But when the UK withdrew from that relationship, it withdrew all of its overseas territories and withdrew the Falklands from its